1 p.m. Eastern. So we'll get started here. And once again, thanks for joining us. And I know this is a busy time of year for many of you. So I think it's great that you're looking to prioritize some of the financial aspects of your company. And for those that don't know Cycle CPA, so we're a remote accounting firm. We do everything from bookkeeping, accounting, advisory level work, all the way to tax preparation, tax planning as well. And we work with a couple hundred companies in the green industry throughout the country. So one of the main goals here is to pass on things that we're seeing, and helping everybody here to maybe not make the same mistakes, or even pointing out certain things that we're seeing that are working within the industry. So thank you for joining us here. Looking forward to diving in.
Thank you, Joe. Thank you. And the reason why we are so passionate about hitting on the overhead subject is because we see from the companies that we manage, the businesses that manage their overhead most efficiently and smarter, those are the companies that are making the highest profits out of all of the other companies that we manage. And so we want to pass along.
I think your audio is.
If you could really optimize that and build that into the show. Oh, yeah, Joe, can you hear me?
Yeah, your audio is cutting in and out. So.
Oh, can you hear me now clearly?
Yes.
Okay. Yeah. So if you're able to optimize that going into 2026 and focus on that, I think it does provide a good return on investment. So any questions that you all have about overhead or something that you're seeing in a printout, please feel free to type it in the chat, and we'll make sure to address it during the webinar. Thank you.
Yeah, so first we're going to give a brief overview of what is overhead. So when you look at a company's financials, overhead expenses are anything that is not directly tied to the work being performed on the projects, whether it's the recurring maintenance that's being done or installation-based work. So these are all expenses like software costs, accounting fees, repairs and maintenance to the trucks and equipment. So that's all of that falls within overhead costs. And one of the ways to think about it as well is ultimately there is that separation between direct costs and overhead, because as you're doing work on certain projects, the most accurate way to recoup certain expenses is oftentimes a lot of the direct costs that are being incurred. Because if you're going to a property and you're installing, let's say, a patio, for sure that patio is directly linked to that specific project, and you're going to recoup those costs and even add in a profit on top of it, right? So having that separation is very important for whatever estimating process that you utilize, because overhead costs are going to have to be recouped in your estimating, but it's going to be done in a different way. So, but like I said, as for overhead costs, think of it as expenses that really can't be tied to a specific project. So things like software expense, right? Things like insurance costs, right? So that's really what falls within your overhead costs. And from an industry perspective, this is some of the data from our clients based on the percentile. So the first percentile, that is not necessarily where you would want to be. The third percentile, that's right where the industry median is, right? So that's where most companies perform. And then over all the way to the fourth and fifth percentiles, those are companies that are operating with more of a lean overhead, and doing well when it comes to managing overhead costs overall. So, in regard to, industry median, you can see for non-install based work. So looking at things like lawn care, lawn maintenance, maybe helping to maintain irrigation systems, those kinds of services. The third percentile or the industry median is around 39%, right? And we always like to see companies shoot for that fourth or fifth percentile, as they're looking to grow, and even just maintain where they are as well. And then we're also looking at the install based work. So whether you're installing hardscape or fencing or softscape, all of that falls within this. And really, again, you can see that these companies tend to manage overhead as a percentage of total revenue a little bit better. So, and that's you could see percentile, the third percentile for the install based workers on 34%, all the way up to some of the best performing companies at that 18%. And in this webinar, we're going to really show you some key insight into how can you get into that fourth or fifth percentile, and how can you maintain that as well as you grow.
Yeah, and in that overhead percentile, your compensation as the owner should be included in that as well. So what you get paid on payroll should be part of that overhead percentage.
And here's some of the industry medians for some of the larger overhead cost items. So you can see everything from marketing, repairs and maintenance, insurance, overhead salaries, and depreciation. Companies that are doing install-based work typically are going to spend a little bit higher on marketing because they're always having to get their next project, right? They're investing a lot more into sales and marketing. Whereas a lot of the non-install based work, typically that's more reoccurring in nature, where you're going to have some of that work from year to year. So again, these are just different industry medians that we're seeing across the industry, and just kind of keep in mind as you scale the company. And looking at overhead costs as a percentage of revenue is good, because whether you're $1 million company or $5 million company or $200,000 company, a lot of these percentages should remain relatively constant as you grow. And when it comes to being able to analyze certain information like that, looking at and making sure that your chart of accounts is accurate and reflects what a green industry chart of accounts should look like is important. Now, a chart of accounts basically like the buckets that all of the banking and credit card transactions get put into, right? So as you go to the gas station, categorizing that as fuel costs. As you go to the landscape nursery, categorizing that as landscape material. So ultimately, when you're looking at your direct costs versus overhead, the correct line items and the correct transactions are falling into each, so that you can see a clear view of, okay, how well are we doing with managing our direct costs? How well are we doing with managing our overhead costs? Because if this is not done well, then you're not going to have that insight. And the reason it's important too is because when you're holding certain team members accountable, whether it's your admin team or people helping out on the projects, having that clear insight will give you that capability of seeing, wow, our direct costs are being managed very well. We're very efficient on the projects, but our overhead is very high. It looks like we might have too many people, or it looks like our repairs and maintenance costs went really high this year. Why is that? Then you can dive deeper into the certain specifics, and really utilize it as a tool. Another example is the proper labor classification between direct costs and overhead labor. So looking at direct labor and making sure that if there's someone that's purely doing estimating, or they're purely managing the operation, they're not actually physically touching the work on the projects, their salary should actually be within the overhead cost area. Looking at things like owner's compensation, as Carla mentioned as well. Your direct labor could look very efficient, but maybe you're not allocating your salary towards that. And maybe you're actually doing 80% of your role is still working on a lot of the projects.
Yeah, we see that with business owners that are just starting up, or you have a smaller business and you're still out there in the field, performing some of the work for your clients and uh, actually, getting your hands dirty. Now, that percentage of the time, for example, let's say that you say, hey, like 40% of my time is actually doing the work. Like I still enjoy doing the work. I go out there, get my hands dirty. 40% of your salary should be allocated to the direct labor cost. And that means above the gross profit line, not in the overhead. Then the rest of your salary, 60%, you're spending managing, hiring, and wearing all the business owner hats that you wear. 60% of that salary needs to go into the overhead. Now, if you are doing work on projects, I'm not talking about management, actually doing work on projects, but your entire salary is in the overhead, it's going to make your overhead look so much higher dollar percentage wise and percentage wise, and it's going to skew the way that you're looking at your overhead costs. So it's important that you talk with your accountant and get that split out. And it could be an estimate. Don't go crazy about tracking hours for yourself. We work a lot, but just as long as you have an estimate, it will give you a better picture. Because if you look at it that way, if you look at it, okay, my employees, they're working in the project. I have to charge my customer for my employees' hours, right? And then I have to make a profit from that. Same thing with yourself as a business owner. Just because you're on the job, that doesn't mean you're working there for free or you're enhancing or anything like that. Your hours count towards that job, because if you weren't there, you would have to have somebody that replaced what you were doing. And so your hours also have to be billed to the client, right? And maybe you bill it at your normal billing rate. Obviously, your billing rate could be really high because you're the owner and you may have a high bill rate for that role, for your CEO role. But as an employee level, you need to be able to fill that in there, because then you're not truly looking at your profit and loss accurately, because that's not being captured in the direct cost section. You need to be in there if you're still doing work. And so having that percentage split will change the way that you're looking at your profit and loss.
Yeah. And companies where the owner is heavily involved, still working on the projects, the net profit for companies like that should be at least 40%, 30, 40, 50%. Why is that? Because they're not having to pay direct labor. Maybe it's at 20, 30% of total revenue for their role. And often the owner is maybe the most efficient one on the crew as well. So, it's especially as you're looking to scale. So, and here's two examples of certain things that we even go over in some of our reporting. Over to the left is an example of a company where you can see the revenue growth, which is the gray line, month after month, which shows the trailing 12-month average. And you can also see down below, it's also tracking cost of goods, or also known as direct costs, and then also the overhead costs. So because this is an overhead webinar, let's just look at the light blue line and the gray. You can see that this company overall is managing their overhead costs pretty well. Why is that? Because as the company is growing in revenue, the overhead trend line is not growing at a faster rate. Now, over time, ultimately, you might be able to find certain efficiencies in certain areas, and you might be able to sustain a situation where overhead costs might decrease a little bit, as you scale revenue when it comes to just the rate of growth. But ultimately, it's going to mirror a little bit more closely what your revenue growth looks like. But you can see an example to the left, they're actually maintaining their overhead at a lower level of growth than the revenue. Now, looking at the graph over to the right, you can see that this company is actually losing revenue each month. But their overhead costs are actually maintaining at the same level, which is not ideal, right? Ultimately, you want it to follow whatever trend your revenue is going in. And sometimes it might not be perfect, right? Because business is not perfect. There's always certain things that might happen, certain delays with things happening in the company and different situations going on. But from a longer term perspective, in a situation with the graph over to the right, you would want to see that overhead decrease, as that revenue decreased. And we're going to get into more again within this webinar in certain ways in how you can do that.
Yeah, and sorry, Joe, can we go back to that graph? Yeah, one thing I wanted to point out is, now, why do we look at these graphs and what is it telling us, right? So the company on the left, you can see that the overhead cost in November go from $40,000 to $30,000. It decreases $10,000, right? And if this is a seasonal business, right, and the non-busy time during the winter, which typically starts in November, December. Now, this means that company, a lot of the overhead costs are usually fixed, right? Like your rent is fixed and, your cell phone is fixed. Your overhead salaries are fixed. And that's why people get into a bind when it comes to overhead costs, because a lot of those are fixed. Like they're not going to go up and down. They're fixed, or if you add on, they're just going to go up, right? And so to the company to the left, what I can see is if they're a seasonal business, it's going down $10,000, they may have some flexible overhead costs that are maybe a little bit more variable, which is more advantageous to you. And we can go over, some of the overhead costs that you may want for it to be more flexible for you if you do run a seasonal business, that goes down as your revenue goes down, right? And on the graph to the right, like you see here, their revenue is going down, but the overhead costs are staying fixed. That means they have a lot of costs in there that, they don't have that flexibility with. So I like to stress, especially with seasonal based businesses, is yes, let's have that nest egg saved. Like let's get you through non-busy season, but at the same time, which of these costs can we make it more flexible, right? And we'll go over some of those items.
Absolutely. And with any growth that you're having with the company, there's always going to be some level of discomfort and risk that's going to be happening, right? But really what it comes down to is it modeled, intentional, and is it supported based on what's going to need to happen within your operations? Now, whenever you're making a decision with certain overhead costs, ask yourself, can I afford this, right? But instead, you can ask, what specific revenue engine will pay for this, and how soon? And the important aspect about that is you don't want to go too long with certain overhead costs if they're not leading to a better company overall, or serving their mission, right? So here's an example, right? So hiring a salesperson, it's tied to the amount of funds that are closed. How long are you going to wait to make a move if it's not working out with that salesperson? And I think it's important to determine that before you even make the hire, and have that expectation with yourself and even with that team member in regard to, okay, this is what the expectation is. And as you're having financial meetings monthly or quarterly, it's looking into that and being realistic with, and kind of from that unbiased look at the financials. Okay, do we want to continue another 6 months with this specific situation or this specific model that's not working out? Another example, adding a crew, right? How much is a crew supposed to produce for you each week, month, year? Are they hitting that goal? Right? Because you don't want to keep scaling a model where crews are not being efficient, right? Or certain things are not happening the way it should be. Hiring an administrative employee, right? Is that actually freeing up your time? Revisit that after 4 or 5 months of that hire being in place. Are you finding that it really did free up some of your time, or did it not? And you need to look into better processes or systems or better training to put them in a better position where it can free up your time more. So making sure that certain decisions, especially with an overhead, are tied to a specific purpose, because if it's not, you're going to quickly go from 20-30% overhead to 40-50% overhead. And what that does is that takes away your net profit. Just as when you look at things like a price increase, where that almost falls directly to your bottom line and you can almost double your margins overnight with a price increase, similar can happen with overhead with certain overhead costs, not inherently built in to directly lead to certain revenue generation, right? So if you're making a certain move with overhead costs, you want to always kind of second guess yourself or hesitate before you make that, because there's a little bit more strategy than some of your direct costs. Because again, when you do a project, it's more direct of understanding, that material is obviously needed, that team member is obviously needed to perform the work, versus your overhead. There's more strategy that's going to have to go into that.
Thank you, Joe. And I see somebody asked, are balance sheet items such as equipment purchases and the supporting payments, I guess loan payments, are they considered overhead? So they're not considered overhead. Equipment purchases are on the balance sheet as assets on the balance sheet because they're going to benefit your business for more than 1 year, so they don't get expensed right away in that year on the P&L.
Yeah.
But they do depreciate. So they're gonna, you're gonna have that wear and tear on your equipment, and the depreciation that comes from that over the next 7 years, that's going to get recorded on your overhead. So like Joe here highlighted, depreciation was at 4.2%, and then for non-install base work at 4.5%. The loan payments also do not go on the actual profit and loss. They go on the balance sheet, but the interest part of that loan payment does go in your overhead as interest expense.
Yeah. Awesome. And thanks, Carl. And Rob. So, and listen, the part of just the running a company in general, many of you are in a situation like Rob, you had mentioned, your overhead is almost 50%. Now, first of all, it's great that you have that insight, to kind of know, okay, where are we starting from? And then it becomes a situation where you can pick, okay, listen, I feel like there isn't as much things that I need to necessarily cut. This is more of something that I'm going to use as a foundation, because this year, based on certain marketing efforts, certain sales efforts, other things that I'm going to implement into the company, and I feel confident about that. I feel confident about other systems that are going to support that revenue when it comes to recruiting, training. The more you have confidence in that, the more you can feel comfortable about understanding that if your revenue this year is at $1 million, but your overhead's at $500,000, wait a second, I'm confident I can get to 1.5 million revenue next year and maintain a lot of that similar overhead without too much of an increase. And then all of a sudden your overhead can go down to 35-40% in 1 year. And then maybe you can make certain other changes as well, as you go throughout, because a lot of these things may not happen within 1 year. It may not happen overnight per se. So it's but as long as you can get more in that trend and kind of where to go. But I would say, if you're necessarily looking to cut overhead, it's really tied a lot to how confident you are with being able to get that revenue and support that moving forward. One of the things as well when it comes to overhead costs is, and what could lead to excessive overhead is when there's too many complexities that are built in. Because at the end of the day, I think sometimes, especially nowadays, there's so many different softwares and ideologies and different things that you can implement, and a lot of things that can kind of cloud up what your main mission is with your company. Right? The main mission is to do great work, make the customer happy, make sure we have great people, keep our people happy, right? And trying to drive toward that result. Now, is it important to have job costing? Yes. Is it, but if we're over analyzing things or building out processes that's not actually leading to any ability to make decisions on the back end, or if we're building out a certain process that again is not leading to a specific result, it's more of just adding administrative complexities to it, or certain pricing models, or do we have way too much equipment? Yeah, we have 5 different service lines, but at the end of the day, maybe we need to narrow it down because we're not utilizing the equipment well enough, because we just don't have as much jobs in each service line to be able to support it. And looking at ways that, as you make things a little bit less complex, it makes the training easier, right? It makes the management oversight a little bit less, and a lot of these things are easier said than done. But I think this is a prime example. I mean, we know some companies. I know a company right in our market here in Long Island that has really simplified the hardscaping component. I think a lot of times people think that maintenance is the only thing that can be streamlined, with building out certain systems and procedures, and but I know even hardscape companies, can build out even their pricing model into certain packages, and have their team really dialed in and understanding what specific kind of job they perform best, right, and doubling down with that. And there's many good aspects of that, but again, just thinking about how can we make our operations a little less complex. It's kind of going through that fine line there. So and we had touched on this briefly before, especially in a seasonal business, always trying to find those opportunities where instead of incurring a fixed cost that you're going to have to maintain all throughout the year, even during the low times, trying to turn it more into a variable cost, right? Something that like subcontracted labor, you're having to pay them for that specific job, but when they're done with that job, you're not necessarily having to pay them as an employee after that. Looking at things like equipment rentals. So yes, it might be more if you look at it for that one job, right? But if you look at it from a full year perspective, is it actually better for the company to rent that piece of equipment for that specialized kind of job or that specialized kind of work? Because if you actually purchase that and keep it around throughout the year, it's actually going to be a larger cost for the company from a year perspective. Looking at fleet maintenance, yeah, it's great to have people in-house that can help with that, but again, it might sound cheaper to do something like that when you just look at, oh wow, we used to have to bring this truck in, but now we have this person that can handle it in-house. Things like that work at scale, but if you don't have enough work for that in-house person year round, you should really look at those costs. And that's why it's good to have updated financials and be able to look at it a yearly basis and say, okay, this is how much we spent on fleet maintenance last year. Are we confident that it's, instead of spending that, we can hire someone to help that? And maybe they don't spend 100% of their time on that, but that's part of what they do, right? Which cross training can help as well. to reduce some of those fixed costs, right? So instead of paying a fleet maintenance person for just that, and kind of being in the hole for 3 months out of the year, maybe you cross train them into some other aspects, within their role as well. Also, outsourcing, certain functions instead of hiring a full-time employee, finding ways to, especially as you grow, your needs are going to change so frequently, where sometimes it's good to work with an organization that can scale with you, right? Instead of having to hire a full-time person when you necessarily can't really afford it yet, you can more utilize a scaled down version, but with a subcontractor or an outsourced administrative function. And
You could also
here's a primary example. There's some times throughout the year when your net cash flow is going to be at low points, right? So it's when you're making those decisions in regard to your overhead costs, think about those times a year, right? And think, okay, how is that going to impact me then? I think that's a key thing to always think about. And overhead salaries. I mean, this is something that's going to make up anywhere between maybe around 40% on average of your total overhead costs, right? Which actually goes to typically around 8 to 11% of total revenue, which is anyone who's not actually physically touching the work on the projects, right? So that's where their salaries are going to fall. And this shouldn't be based on how busy people are. It should be based on how much revenue the company is going to be able to produce in that given period, because that's going to give you more of an insight into what kind of level of administrative team you can have. Also, making sure that you have the right team members that match what specific tasks they should be doing, right? And I think oftentimes when we're looking at certain team members that are doing work on projects or certain contracts out on the jobs, you have a clear view into certain people's weaknesses, or this person prefers more of maintenance, or this person's more technical and has more experience with certain aspects of installation work. Think of that in terms of your administrative team. What are their strengths and weaknesses? What is their time best spent on? And trying to build it out from there, because as Carla mentioned in the beginning, I think this is, and again, the whole idea about this webinar today is how to get a competitive advantage in your market by managing these costs that other contractors are not really focusing on.
Yeah, and I think, let's say if you hire an office administrator, right? Their salary is going to be in the overhead cost section. One of the things that you could do is, hire them based on a part-time level. And if you're a seasonal business that needs extra help during the summertime, you can do something where it's just a temp role. You hire another person temporarily, or call it an internship, for a college student, whatever it is, right? But you don't need that full-time person year round, or it depends on the task that you have that administrator do, right? Whether it's answering calls, scheduling, collecting payments from customers, paying your bills, right? Different things like that. Trying to think about each one of those tasks. For example, picking up the phone, that could be something that an outsourced person can take care of, probably at a lower cost. Or maybe you have like a different system that can work for you. There's a lot of technology out there nowadays that can, take calls, relay the message and then get back to them. But I think first listing the tasks that person does from an overhead perspective will give you a lot of clarity. So like Joe said, you can match those tasks with their salary level, right? You don't want somebody, for example, one of your managers, right? You don't want them spending time delivering materials to the job site. It's not efficient.
Yeah.
So really working out the tasks and trying to either implement some sort of technology or delegate it to someone else that matches that salary level will enhance the efficiency and the capacity of that person to be able to do other items as well.
Yeah. Yeah. And kind of going off what you said, Carla, in regard to capacity, and this is oftentimes, I think, a lot of conversations that we have with companies as they scale, it's as the overhead team reaches capacity, then it becomes, okay, what is a cost-effective way that we can maybe work with another partner or another company that can help us? And then even ultimately, you can leverage their expertise as well, right, with that certain move. Now, one of the things with certain overhead costs too is you don't want to be too lean with your overhead. Now, it's good to be lean with your overhead, but being lean with your overhead can also be a sign that you're overstressing the team and you're not supporting the main operations as well as they should be supported, right? So there's two buckets, right? You have one bucket where the overhead is lean, the operation is running smoothly. Over the past 3 years, they found different ways to manage the company better. They need less management oversight because they've improved the training process, versus another company that, again, they've underinvested in certain overhead items and they haven't had the systems or the software or the processes to be able to support it, right? Which then just leads more strain and stress to the team. And here's an example of, try to, okay, well, so okay, here you go. I'm sorry, guys. Let me, there you go. Now you can see the bottom graph. But as we mentioned before, you want to let overhead and that investment be guided by what can be supported based on the size of your company, revenue-wise, right? So you can see over to the left, the companies that are doing $300,000 in revenue, at 10% of total revenue, they have an overhead allocation available of around $30,000, right? That they can pay to a outsourced bookkeeper, maybe someone helping with marketing, even allocating some of that to the owner to help with invoicing and certain admin duties. And then as the company grows, 1.2 million revenue, have an overhead allocation of 120. Now the owner can take a pretty significant salary and have some left over as well. And each company operates differently. As an example, company B could be in a circumstance where the overhead, in essence, almost all of it goes to the owner because the owner is doing a lot of the overhead tasks. Where maybe we might work with another company where the owner only spends half his time working on administrative tasks, and he also has an office manager, right, or an admin person, right? So it's kind of understanding what is that total overhead allocation that we have available, and then a $5 million company, having a roughly 500,000 as that bucket, right? So, again, it's kind of thinking creatively of how can we utilize that as best as possible. And I think because we are an accounting firm, we see it very commonly on the accounting side, where situations where a $5 million company might come to us and say, listen, we were thinking about hiring a controller, but we have someone that can do a lot of the accounting functions. Can you guys help with some of the oversight and some of the reporting and maybe some of the forecasting and help to put the pieces together? Or you might be in a situation like company B where listen, it's the owner doesn't want to spend 100%, a lot of his time doing any accounting in general. We could take on most of it, right? So as you scale, there's different ways that you can leverage certain overhead costs and certain people to kind of help to get you to that point while staying within that overhead allocation that you can afford for that given level. And going back to what I'd said before, the more confident you are that you can go, like in this example, maybe that $1.2 million company, maybe their overhead salaries we're already at 200,000. But they said, listen, we're going to do massive growth this year. We're going to hit 2 million. And that's actually going to be able to support that 200,000 overhead salary allocation. Again, it comes down to how confident are they to hit that? Do they have a track record? Well, actually, last year they already grew by 700,000. So it's technically they grew by 700,000. Now they want to grow by 1 million. They're saying that they have the systems. They've already hired a couple great employees. They've hired a new marketing partner that's already starting to perform for them. That's what we like to see. We like to see some sort of historical trend or proof that this can work out, because we don't want that company to hit 1.5 million instead of 2 million, and in essence 50 to 100,000 kind of goes to overhead costs that maybe shouldn't have, right? So these are all things to consider as you grow.
Yeah, and usually what I see with companies in that 300 to $1 million range is maybe they are optimizing overhead cost, and all of their overhead cost seems reasonable. Like they're not overpaying somebody, or they don't have like high interest or a lot of repairs and maintenance. Like all of their overhead cost seems reasonable, but dollar amount wise, right? So dollar amount wise, everything seems reasonable, but percentage, like as a percentage to revenue, it may look high. It may look high. The reason behind that scenario is that at like 300 to $1 million, you may not have your marketing engine optimized and your advertising figured out. And so, especially if you're an install-based company that always needs to generate new leads and new projects and stuff like that, if your revenue is not consistent every single month, if you don't make the same amount of revenue each month, or if your revenue dips and then there's a lot of ebbs and flows throughout the year, and I'm not talking about seasonality, I'm just talking about in general. If your revenue is not predictable because your leads are not predictable, because you're not putting an emphasis on marketing, then like Joe showed in that graph, your overhead costs might, end up growing at a faster rate, or you may not just have enough revenue to cover those overhead costs. And that could be the scenario for a lot of people. And when we see how much marketing is being spent as a percentage of revenue, we saw around 2%, which is very low in this industry. It's very low, the investment in marketing. And so it's worth it to invest in marketing if you see that you're getting predictable returns, because if you can predict your revenue, then your fixed costs are not going to be as much of a problem when it comes to percentage of revenue. And that's why I like the recurring maintenance model, or at least having that up to a point where it covers your fixed costs, right?
Absolutely. Yeah, sometimes making certain investments could impact and make a big, can lead to you not hitting certain revenue goals, and not hitting revenue goals is not the place you want to be. So, and marketing is a perfect example of this, right? Like not all overhead is created equal, in the sense of some should be viewed more from the lens of getting a certain ROI and really getting value from that investment, right? So whether it's things like marketing, software expense, right? Things like recruiting, right? Making sure that you're getting the right people. Do you always want to go with the lowest cost software option, or process, or people that are going to support that operation. No, because that's one of the most important things in your company, right? So thinking about that versus more the things that are just, okay, this is really, we're just looking for the lowest cost in a lot of these things, whether it's things like certain facility expenses, office supplies, right? Trying to, make sure, listen, our office supplies shouldn't double this year when nothing really changed in our company, right? So making sure that we're taking a close look into stuff like that and understanding what that difference is. And another way to think about this as well is understanding, and I think this is helpful, especially for companies that are scaling, is there are certain parts of your company that shouldn't necessarily be impacted by the growth that you're having as a company. All right. So maybe your company has 5 crews, but this year you're looking to add 3. So pretty aggressive growth. You shouldn't necessarily incur more overhead costs for those existing crews and your existing operation. But for the growth that you're having, looking into those crews and understanding that you might not be able to operate as lean there because there's certain delays when it comes to efficiencies. There's going to be more sales efforts, right? Because you're growing more. You're creating that crew, like you're putting that crew together. You're having to gain more clients, right? Whereas a more established crew with their routes, you're not having to incur as much of that cost, right? So it's understanding that, okay, what is the core operation? If you're a $2 million company, your core operation should be performing well. And then if you have growth investments on top of that, looking at as kind of a separate item, and again, making sure that we're revisiting that each month or each quarter to make sure that we're checking on the status of how that's going. And when you're thinking about overhead costs, look at your financials, base it off of your company, right? Because that's ultimately, you're not going to want to use what industry averages are, what your friend says you should charge, or whatever it is, right? Because you want to, have an understanding that you're covering for what your depreciation costs are, what your overhead is, so, and the more accurate you can come with that, not that you need to charge that to your customer, but it's good to understand what is the lowest amount that I can charge my customer to make a 50% net profit. Because that's different for every company. And here's an example, right? Company B versus company A. Now, assuming that there are the same labor hours needed for that specific project that they're bidding on, and that there's the same materials and the same cost of goods or cost of sales involved for each hour that needs to work, company B has to charge $29 an hour for their overhead costs, whereas company A only charges $24 an hour because company A is very optimized. They're using software. They have great processes built out, where they can make the same profit, but with less overhead costs, right? So you can see ultimately company A, if let's say they're going just by price alone, which of course there's other value and things that can be done in the sales process, but this will lead to ultimately you having a more of a competitive advantage in your market over time, because company A will have to charge less in order to make the same profit. And it's not only a competitive advantage, but when certain things happen in your market, whether it's a recession or whether, especially for a company that's operating for 20 years, there's going to be ups and downs, right? So it's always better to prepare your company before you need to prepare your company, because you're going to be able to make even more strategic and better decisions over a longer period of time, rather than being more in a scared mindset and, more of a reactive mindset as certain things happen. And then, so really, we want to encourage everyone to really think hard about your certain overhead investments that you're looking to make, and be creative with this as well, because there's often certain things that can be done where, you know, you can have two companies that do very similar services, very similar business models, where one has 45% overhead, the other has 25% overhead. That's an enormous difference, right? That's 20%, right? So really trying to think about and invest your time into, okay, what are certain processes or systems or software that can help the company, right? And then it's drawing that fine line, right, between, okay, what are certain distractions that are also kind of holding us up from being able to keep things as less complex as possible. So it's there's definitely an art to it. There's no perfect equation to scaling a business, but it's constantly thinking about kind of looking at the financials and thinking about a lot of what we had discussed here today. And definitely, if anyone has any questions, please continue to mention in the chat. So Jody asked, adding crew would be overhead. So a crew, most of that expense would actually fall in your direct costs. So that wouldn't necessarily impact overhead costs. However, if someone on your crew spends half their time just managing that crew, not actually working on the jobs, and they're going around to all the crews around town to make sure everything is online, maybe they're talking to customers, half of their salary can be allocated to overhead costs. But most of the crew's costs, that's going to fall more within your direct costs. And Rob, this pretty sure this whole Zoom is about me. It's not, this is, I think that's one thing, because we work within the green industry. This is more of a compilation of things that we see working with all of our clients, right? And different, because at the end of the day, just like how when you guys approach your customers and clients and recommend based on your experience, okay, we shouldn't do the drainage like this on this property because I did it 3 years ago with this customer, or I saw my competitor do it and I had to fix what they did. So we definitely cannot do that, right? So it's and I think that's what a lot of business is, right? It's trying to look at what happened in the past, what are things we can learn from, and moving on from there. So, and yeah, this is recorded, so I'm going to send this off to everybody who had registered for the webinar. So, which is everyone that's here live as well. And so, definitely thinking about what your next move is, right? And trying to back that based on a lot of what we had talked about. Whether it's getting a new estimator, admin hire, software, kind of tying that to certain results. And you can email me if you have any questions, call, text me. You can go on our website, Cycle CPA, as well, to learn a little bit more about what we do as a firm. I see a lot of familiar names here as well that are either clients that we've spoken to in the past. And but yeah, definitely don't hesitate to reach out if you have any questions, or if there's anything we can do to help. And I'll wait a couple seconds here to see if there's any other questions that filter in. But I think we got to most of them here. So, but I think it's great that, again, everybody was able to join. I know April 2nd is things are picking up for sure with your work. So it's awesome stuff. But
yeah, no, and just one more thing I wanted to add in regard to overhead and especially talking to a lot of the business owners we work with is just speaking about talent and how do we attract good employees, reliable people, because this does tie into overhead costs and your recruiting expense. And I don't really see a lot of recruiting expense on the P&L nowadays. And so really investing into recruiting, whether that's ads on Indeed, or maybe you hire a content creator that can make a video for you and that can, convey your message and attract employees, or maybe you come up with a management plan or a management track, or some of the other creative ways to attract employees, or you just add a really good compensation package with good benefits, right? Even though all of those items fall into the overhead bucket, but those items would provide a dividend, because then you would be able to attract better talent that may get the job done quicker, and you can rely on them, and they're going to be efficient. Also, if you're training that staff member, or your manager is training that staff member, your salary and your manager's salary, that's an overhead. So if it takes a long time to train somebody up, right, that's a lot of hours and money lost on that. Or if you end up with a bad hire, just it's better to let them go. Or if they need more training, then that's going to be more time that's spent on that. And so it might look as if, okay, I'm going with the cheapest option, I'm getting somebody that doesn't have a lot of experience or whatever it is, but that may create more of a bottleneck moving forward. Just something to think about, because I know a lot of people are there's a lot of conversation about employees and how to attract them nowadays, and we can definitely have a whole webinar about that, I feel like, but just in how that relates to some of the overhead costs here.
Awesome, everybody. Well, listen, hope everybody has a great rest of your day. Thanks for joining us, and looking forward to the next webinar.
Yeah, nice seeing everybody. Thank you. Have a nice day. Bye.